my suspicion that I raised over lunch and that resulted in writing this essay is that we are, in a sense, moving back towards a much more pagan way of doing things and of regarding the world, particularly when it comes to, my argument in this essay is that abortion is a key indicator of this repaganization process, in that it seems as though we're moving back towards a more Roman way of regarding abortion and indeed infanticide. And from your perspective as someone who has spent an enormous amount of time studying the Roman world, including as an archaeologist, what are your feelings on this this move in a more pagan direction?
I must admit, when I first read a book making this argument, and it of course wasn't yours, your book, The Case Against a Sexual Revolution, makes a very different argument. I first read a book called Pagans and Christians in the City, which is lurking about in my shelves here somewhere. And I reviewed it some years ago, back in 2019, for Law and Liberty, which is the magazine where I'm senior writer. And Stephen Smith, the bloke who wrote it, is a lawyer, but he knows a lot about theology. So he's kind of like me. He's got the same kind of legal training as I have, but dabbles in theology because he has access to the ancient languages. So he's got quite similar background to me. And he makes an argument that Christianization in the Western world was incomplete, except perhaps in the United States. America is kind of a special case because of the way Europe expelled its religious extremists and they went to the United States, particularly Britain. And his point, his sort of main claim, is that paganism is just as much a religious sensibility as Christianity. We've got this idea in our head where we tend to think of religion and we define religion and we conceive of it only in monotheistic terms. And so we forget that there are other religious traditions in the world which are not like that at all. You can even have non-theistic ones like Buddhism, for example, that still has supernatural elements, it's just non-theistic. But he also, his big core thing is that Roman paganism was just as much a religion that provided comfort and a framing device for people in that civilization as Christianity or Islam or Judaism does for people in the monotheistic traditions, or Buddhism or Shinto or Confucianism and Hinduism do for the rest of the world. And he then says that Christianity's victory over paganism was incomplete. And he thinks, and he makes a pretty compelling case for this, although he does leave some points out, which I said in my review, that paganism is re-emerging in Western countries as Christianity declines. And his argument is that because the moral shifts that have occurred in Western societies have had the effect of bringing Western countries into line with pagan morality, particularly on sexual matters, rather than Christian morality. And the big case studies he provides are, of course, over same-sex marriage and abortion. But he addresses some other issues like the use of religious symbols. When should you use religious symbols publicly and when should you not, and so on and so forth. These were also conflicts in the Roman world as well, when Christians and pagans were in contest and neither was powerful enough to knock over the other, which was actually for quite a long period after the Edict of Toleration in 313 AD of Constantine's, because only about 10% of the population of the Roman Empire in that period was actually Christian. And so they were aware they were massively outnumbered, and if they pushed too hard and too fast with this new religious tradition, which was very foreign to Romans, you would finish up with serious conflict. I mean, this is a society that, like the United States, would resolve serious conflict at the most abstract level by means of bloody civil wars with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dead. Just like the United States, this is where it's legitimate to draw a similarity between the modern hegemon imperial power and the ancient imperial power. You know, a Roman would look at the US Civil War and 600,000 dead, and that it was over slavery, and go, slave revolts, I know what those look like, and look at all those dead people. So you get that. And so that was Smith's argument, and I thought that there was something in it. And it was that that came to mind when we were chatting at that lunch.
Because the argument that you will get from a lot of anti-Christians, say new atheists, is that once we can kind of shrug off Christianity's oppressive force, then we can refashion an entirely new and much more rational, much more enlightened, much less religious sort of dominant ideology. I am by no means original in pointing out that actually what we're seeing with progressivism as a dominant ideology is a very long way from being that kind of rational, anti-religious way of viewing the world. I mean, there are clearly some elements of progressivism which are Christian inspired. But I think, and I think you agree with me, that actually there probably are only so many ways of, let me rephrase that. There are probably only so many ideologies that can function as dominant ideologies in enormously large, complex civilizations. And paganism is one of them, and Christianity is one of them. And there might not be very more than that. And so it would probably make sense that once we dechristianize, that we revert to the old way of doing things rather than invent something entirely new.
The problem with new atheism is that it thought, or it, doing what you should never do as a lawyer, which is ascribing a corporate view to a large number of people. Significant numbers of people in the new atheist movement thought that you could do away with religion. And if you did away with it, you would then have basically a sort of Enlightenment type society, you know, the kind of world imagined by Adam Smith and David Hume and people like that. And the thing is, not only were Adam Smith and David Hume much more sophisticated thinkers than that, they were not simplistic anti-religious people, particularly not Smith, who was a deist. David Hume couldn't take up the professorship of political economy at Glasgow because he'd been too open about his atheism, but Adam Smith could. And even then, they were both very, very nuanced thinkers. And so what happens is if you get rid of one form of religion, you leave, and the expression that gets used around the place, you leave a God-shaped hole in society. And people want to stick things in that hole. And at the beginning, when you first get this, you get this bowerbird effect and that's what's happened with left progressivism. They've gone around and picked a bit from Christianity, they've picked a bit from Roman paganism, they've actually picked bits from Germanic paganism in the environment movement. You know, this whole sort of sacral nature that it's attached to trees and that kind of thing. That's not even Roman paganism, that's Germanic, as Stephen Smith goes into this quite well. I mean, a good example of the early importation of German-style paganism into Christianity is the Christmas tree. The Christmas tree is not Roman. Lots of Christmas aspects of the Christmas celebration are taken from the Roman Saturnalia, the giving of gifts and the kissing under the mistletoe and that kind of thing. The tree is not. The tree is actually from Germanic paganism, and it didn't actually arrive in the UK until Prince Albert, because he was German, so he brought the Christmas tree when she came across from his country. And so what happens is you get this God-shaped hole, and people chuck all sorts of things into it, and it can look, and that to me, like, I look at sort of modern left progressivism, and it looks completely bonkers because it's just such a mess. But the thing is, if you look at early Christianity before Constantine, who did not like this sort of schism, and it's not because he had a concept of heresy that hadn't really been developed then. It was just because he was one of these people who was just impatient with people arguing over incredibly petty details of doctrine. So that's why you get things like the Nicene Creed and that kind of thing, is this attempt to get all this sort of stuff that had just been chucked into the pot, that was the beginning of what scholars call a new religious movement, and try to give it some coherence. Now, that hasn't happened with left progressivism. So you've got Roman attitudes on homosexuality and Roman attitudes on abortion. but you've got Germanic paganism in the environment movement. You've got Christian ideals in the valorization of victims. This is a very important part of Christianity. And the argument is made at book length by Tom Holland in a book called Dominion, which I was supposed to review for a magazine that then went broke. And so I've got Dominion on still in my review shelves there. There it is. And I read it, but I never got to write the review because the magazine went broke. But at least I got the book for free. And this is made at book length by Holland, and he makes out his case. He just builds up such an overwhelming body of evidence on the fact that Christianity did take victims, qua victims. I'm using a philosophical term there, or in a lawyer's term. Basically, Christianity argued that victims, just by virtue of the fact that they were victims, should be listened to. Now, people sort of get this a bit wrong with the Roman lawyers, the jurists. And it's not that Romans thought that victims should never be listened to. They just didn't think victims had automatic authority by virtue of their suffering. So the basic Roman understanding, and this is from Stoicism, is that suffering doesn't improve people. It can improve people, but you can't assume it. Something more is needed. And one of the reasons why early Christians had to put so much intense focus on arguing that victims did have something to say and you should listen to them just because they were victims is because they were trying to convince a population, particularly once they got to Italy itself, where everybody south of the Po was a citizen. So they were going to the heart of the metropolis, basically, if you want to speak in colonial terms. They had to try to persuade these people that they should listen to a message produced by someone who'd suffered capital punishment. And the thing is, by this period, by the time the 1st and 2nd century AD was around, had come along, the empire was at its most prosperous, a level of prosperity not reached again until the 18th century in Europe, remember this. At its most populous, a level of population, once again, not reached in Europe until the 18th century, the Dutch Golden Age, basically. And scholars of the Roman political economy, like Peter Teman wrote a book called The Roman Market Economy, goes into all the clear metrics, all the evidence base for this. So trying to convince people who are about as prosperous and as orderly and as well governed as you get before the Industrial Revolution, that they should listen to someone that their very good legal system, that they knew was very good, they knew that they were an example to the world in this area. The Romans could be very arrogant about the things that they were good at, the same way the Greeks could, and they were good at different things. And the Romans knew that their legal system was very good, had executed. And executed, despite what all the gospel stories say and all of the theological disputations afterwards, the execution was for a public order offence, the riot in the temple. Okay, so Romans really look down on this. You know how people react now to street preachers? Haranguing to a Roman or even a Greek too. Demagogos. That person is that's the root word for our modern word demagogue. So Christians who tended to stand on street corners and harangue people, you would get a response from a Roman the same way that you get from modern people of, oh dear, that's bonkers, and crossing the street. Get as far away as possible. So that is why they had to put so much emphasis on this point that victims, just because they're victims, have something to tell us. And there's a serious case to be made that the Christian conception of sainthood, which is where someone has suffered terribly and risen above it to become a remarkable person, was in fact developed to deal with the fact that Romans were very skeptical of the idea that you could suffer terribly, rise above it, and become a better person, because of this underlying belief that suffering didn't improve people.
And this idea now of victimhood being virtuous is deeply, deeply baked in to the West, as Tom Holland
and
argues.
It is completely not Roman. It is the one area where left-progressivism, and I can sum it up from like summoning up from Hades and giving them a cup of blood, because that was the ancient idea that if you gave a shade from Hades a cup of blood or broth, blood broth, they would then be able to speak to you. That's a sort of very powerful image in both Roman and Greek religions, and it's done very movingly and powerfully in Greek theatre and also in the Aeneid. So they drink a blood broth and then they can speak to you because it gives them a sort of shadow self of aliveness rather than just being a shade. And if you summoned up a Roman jurist, summoned up Ulpian, or summoned up Gaius, or particularly Celsus, who's the one that Nietzsche uses in Genealogy of Morals, and showed them this valorization of people who are not only victims but losers, people that Romans thought of as losers, grossly overweight, covered in self-harm scars. I mean, you know what a Roman response to someone covered in self-harm scars would be? By the name of all that is holy, why didn't you finish the job?
Yeah.
That would be the response.
Yeah.
Okay, so because suicide to a Roman was noble, was a noble thing to do. If your life was intolerable, or you were being oppressed, or you were being in danger, and this is particularly in a military context, of being captured and giving away military secrets, then the honourable thing to do was to commit suicide. And the phrase used in Latin, I'll translate it into English, is the same as the one used amongst Japanese troops during the Second World War. There's strong similarities between Shintoism and Roman paganism, was death before dishonour. So, yeah, really different. This is one where there's just no overlap at all.